Welcome back to Model UN 101, and in this video we're going to cover the fundamental knowledge you need to simulate the United Nations, which is, of course, what is the United Nations? So the UN came about towards the end of World War II and was the successor to a similar organization called the League of Nations. Now, the basic mandate behind the UN was effectively, we've just had two massive world wars. Clearly, whatever we're doing to maintain world peace isn't working, so let's set up a new organization that's going to try and keep the peace in various ways. Now, there are two primary things that the UN does to try and keep the peace. The first of these is actual military peacekeeping. And it does this differently to the League of Nations, which is part of why the League of Nations failed, in that the League of Nations didn't have forces of its own to contribute to a conflict. So if there was a regional conflict that had a very shaky peace agreement or still had active hostilities, the League of Nations was effectively inadequate at dealing with that situation. What the UN does is it has military forces temporarily loaned to it by member nations. They fall under UN command for that period, and they are then deployed to those nations as peacekeepers with their little blue helmets to not only prevent hostilities from breaking out, but also help keep those communities together to try and stop regional conflicts prolonging or blowing up into something even bigger. Now, decisions about peacekeeping are made by one specific UN body called the Security Council. The Security Council is a bit different to the other UN bodies in that it has fewer members, only 15, and 5 of those are permanent nations that are always on the Security Council. It has veto power for those 5 nations, and the decisions it makes are binding. In other words, the Security Council is the body in the UN that actually takes action. Okay? That's one way of keeping the peace. The second way that the UN keeps the peace, and this is by far the more broad objective, is to generally facilitate communication and diplomacy between the nations involved. And you might say, well, that's a bit broader, that's a bit less tangible, but it's actually by far the more important function that the UN serves. And we can think about this as an analogy to a marriage, in a way. If you had a marriage that was only kept together by force, by the law keeping them together, by the risk and cost of divorce, by the difficulty of separating assets, all that sort of stuff, you wouldn't have a very healthy marriage, and you'd still have a marriage with plenty of conflict. What actually makes a relationship healthy and prevents conflict is intangible things like communication and trust and empathy and knowing what other people think on a topic and negotiating out your differences. So what the UN does in general is it gets diplomats together from around the world. They debate issues and of course sometimes have stern words for the diplomats of other nations, but really the general function is to keep everybody at least on the same page, stop them isolating into allies versus enemies or similar dichotomies, and in that way help maintain world peace, at least to a general degree. Now, if you're not in the Security Council, when you're simulating the UN, you are probably going to be simulating a General Assembly Committee. And there are a few of those, and they specialize in different topic areas. They don't just talk about conflict. They talk about climate change and economics and humanitarian development and education, all manner of things, actually. But they'll all generally come within the purview of the GA. Now, the GA represents all of the member states of the UN, which is about 193 as of the time of filming, and everyone has an equal vote. And those are the two basic types of UN committee that you might end up simulating. But whether you are in the GA or whether you're in the Security Council, the basic theme is going to be the same. The UN gets diplomats from each nation, and you'll represent one of those diplomats. It selects a topic or an agenda to talk about, so you'll go and find your country's position on that topic, you'll come into committee, and then you'll debate a topic. And part of the reason why we buy into the UN and why we have faith in it as an international organization is because it has specific rules of procedure that allocate speaking time and procedural rights and so on relatively fairly. So particularly if you're in the GA, but even if you're in the Security Council, you'll be entering this relatively fair playing field with other diplomats, and you will be partly doing diplomacy to try and get along with others and understand them and be nice to them, but also partially acting in your country's best interests to try to make sure that if the committee does reach an agreement, it's at least viable for your nation, or better than it would have been had you not been in attendance. And that's the core theme of what we try and do in Model UN.